Okay, I'm in some park right now, and I'm going to have to do this as quickly as possible, so bear with me. This is the study guide for Kōda Rohan's Encounter with Skull, Taidokuro, written in, published in 1890, so in Meiji 23, Meiji the year 23. So there are, I think, 20 questions on the study guide. You'll need to answer all those for your assignment. And before the study questions, we have some terms that you need to know. 10 terms you need to know. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Allegory. So this work is, I think, an allegory. It can be read allegorically. So what is an allegory? Japanese say gui, gua, allegori. The word derives from the Greek allegoria, meaning to speak otherwise. The term loosely describes any writing in verse or prose that has a double meaning. So just think of double meaning whenever you hear the word allegory. This narrative acts as an extended metaphor in which persons, abstract ideas, or events represent not only themselves on a literal level, but they also stand for something else on a symbolic level. An allegorical reading usually involves moral or spiritual concepts that might be more significant than the actual literal events described in the narrative. Typically, an allegory involves the interaction of multiple symbols, which together create a moral, spiritual, or even political meaning. The act of interpreting a story as if each object in it had an allegorical meaning is called allegoresis. Alright? So basically, allegory is any story in which all of the major events, all of the major characters stand for something else. They can be read on a double level. Alright. So as you read this story, Taidokuro, consider whether it's an allegory. If it is an allegory, what does the main character represent? What does the woman represent? What does every stage in the plot represent? And so forth. Allusion, number 2. Genkyu in Japanese, genkyu. Allusion is a direct reference in any literary work to a person, place, or thing in history or another work of literature. So if there's a direct reference in the work to, say, a poem by Saigyo, that's an allusion. And you want to be careful to distinguish this between this with intertextuality, which is similar but different. Intertextuality is not so direct. It's indirect sort of affinity with a previous work. So keep that in mind. I think that was on one of the other handouts that I gave. Next is didactic literature. Didactic means teaching something. Is this work that we're reading right now an instance of didactic literature or not? Consider that as you read. Literature written with the expressed intent to teach something, usually something ethical in nature. And Kōda Rohan, of course, the author of this story, was a devout Buddhist, and most of his works have some Buddhist themes or Buddhist messages or Buddhist emphases. You'll want to keep that in mind as you read it. So is there a didactic purpose in this story? Again, I'm asking a bunch of questions, but this isn't really... These aren't the study questions, those are listed below. These are just the terms you need to keep in mind as you read the story. Next we have aestheticism, in Japanese tambi shugi, art for art's sake literature, a sensibility or philosophy that regards the creation of aesthetic pleasure as the ultimate or proper aim of art. Aestheticism sort of came into Japan around 1900, 1902, 1903, so this is a little bit before that, so I don't know why this is on the study sheet, but whenever you read Tanizaki or Akutagawa or those authors, you want to keep this idea of aestheticism or tambi shugi in mind. Next is a narratological term, free indirect discourse, and it means third-person narration in which the character's thoughts or expressions are presented in the character's voice without being set off by quotation marks or the usual addition of phrases like he thought or she said, and without shifting into grammatical first-person discourse. For example, it was a hot day. What on earth was she doing lugging stones on a day like this? Right? That's the example. Her words, cast in first person, are conveyed directly without any phrase such as she said or she thought. So we'll see numerous instances of this technique, not only in this story, but in all Japanese literature. In fact, this technique is so natural to Japanese speakers and Japanese writers that I don't think they're even really aware of this technique when they use it. And you'll want to compare this with direct discourse, which would be, she said, why is it so hot? Right? and indirect discourse, which would simply be she wondered why it was so hot, right? So free indirect discourse as contrasted with direct discourse and indirect discourse. Those are the sort of three ways of conveying somebody's thoughts or statements. Next is a very important word in the context of modern Japanese literature, genbun ichi, written with genbun ichi. So gen to bun ga ichi suru to imi da. Modern colloquial style. First advocated in the 1880s, it became the dominant mode of writing after 1895. By 1910, the style had become so widespread that the term was no longer used. So it's basically the modern vernacular, right? Before the Meiji period, before modernity of the Meiji period, we had numerous styles of prose that were used, and those sort of disappeared in the modern period by 1910, and were replaced with this genbun ichi. So when you open up a novel today, all of them are written in genbun ichi. Newspapers are written in genbun ichi. And genbun ichi is, the characteristic is sentences that end in dearu, or da. Right? These are new inventions that you do not find in pre-Meiji literature. The next term, Gazoku Setchutai, is sort of a combination of the old classical language and colloquial language that's spoken in Tokyo on the streets. Gazoku Setchutai, right? In English, it's translated as the refined colloquial mixed style. This written style first emerged during the Edo period. From 1890 to 1895, there was a brief return to this style in the literary world, but this all ended with the anti-Chinese sentiment that reached fever pitch during the Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So again, this work we're reading today is written in 1890. So it's basically written in the Gazoku Setchutai style, right? So this is part of the reason why most Japanese, I've taught this in the original, this story in the original, in several classes at several different universities, and invariably the students are unable to read it, which is kind of strange. It's hard to think of another country where a work from 1895 or 1890 is pretty much unreadable to contemporary students, right? In English, we don't have that many problems reading something from 1890. In French, it's the same. German, it's the same, I imagine. But Japanese have trouble reading anything that's written before the establishment of genbun ichi, right? So there's a lot of sort of Chinese influences, Chinese style, Chinese phrases, stuff that's no longer really used, and the grammar is different. So keep in mind that the story in the original is written in Gazoku Setchutai. Next is a very, very important word in the context of the Meiji period, which again is from 1867 to 1912, 1868 to 1912 rather. Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, it's translated as. This is the chief slogan of the Meiji period. By leaving the city, the character Rohan in the story, the city of course is the hub of modern civilization and enlightenment. By leaving the city, Tokyo, he leaves Bunmei Kaika. The character Rohan seems to be searching for something that is not offered by any of these new enlightenment modernization ideals, right? He's sort of leaving the world of Meiji Japan and going into the past, into something else. What he seeks is something more fundamental, something more primal, something more urgent, something more spiritual. Alright, and very closely linked with this key phrase, Bunmei Kaika, is another key phrase, key slogan from the Meiji period, Risshin Shusei, which literally means pull up yourself and go out into the world. And it's basically the Meiji Era ethos of personal advancement, which came about after the abolishment of the Shi no Kousho official class system. Shi no Kousho is another word you want to remember. Shi is of course Bushi, samurai class. No is Nogyo class, the farmers, the peasants. Ko is the artisan class, and Sho is the merchant class. Shi no Kousho. And these are the four basic classes that were established in Confucian thought in China in antiquity, and they made their way into Japan and became sort of the foundation for Japanese society. And this system was pretty much collapsed in the Meiji period, right? So you have this fixed class system collapsed, and people for the first time have the ability or the freedom to move about in their class. They might be born into the merchant class, but they might want to aspire to something else. Or you could say it more cynically and say everybody became Shō, which was at the bottom of the Confucian scale, but in the new capitalist era, the Shō became the new dominant class, and everyone aspired to be a merchant, to be a capitalist, to make money and profit and all that stuff. So the character in this story, unlike the character Rohan in this story, unlike his contemporaries and everybody around him, seems to have no interest in getting ahead in Rishin Shusei, right? In this new competitive capitalist world of Meiji Japan. So you might be able to read this story as kind of a critique of Meiji Bunmei Kaikai Enlightenment. Alright, that's the background information you need to know going into this story. Now, after you read the story, you will want to answer these 20 questions that I'm about to explain. Part 1 of the story. Briefly look at the original. Is it written in Genbun-ichi style or the Gazoku Setchu style? I sort of answered this in my explanation of the terms. Just answer that briefly. Number 2, what is the point of view of the story? In other words, the POV. Is it first person or third person? How would you describe the narrator? Is he a reliable narrator? Should we trust him? Rank his reliability on a scale of 1 to 10 and explain the reasons. Number 3, the narrator says that he has made himself a companion of the Do, as he says in the translation on page 90. What does he mean by this? What is a companion of the Do? Of course, the name Rohan, which he took for himself, Kōda Rohan took for himself as his pen name, is also the name of the character in the story, the main character. What does this mean that he's the companion of the Do? And furthermore, how does this character type of an aimless drifter or an aimless wanderer fit into the literary tradition, right? Kōda Rohan grew up reading the classics, grew up reading the works of the Edo period, and is very familiar with, say, the works of Matsuo Basho, or the Taoist sage Zhuangzi, who's sort of the founder, one of the two founders of Taoism, and also the medieval wandering priest and poet of Japan named Saigyo, and also romantic poets such as Wordsworth and so forth, which Kōda Rohan probably would have been familiar with. So this idea of the aimless drifter, the aimless wanderer that you see in the East Asian literary tradition, you also see in the romantic tradition, you see elements of it in this story. Explain those elements is the question. Number 4 is not a question but a brief point. This story should make it clear that even when the author and the narrator share a same name, as is the case here, the work should be read as a fictionalized narrative. In short, avoid the watashi shousetsu, or the autobiographical mode of reading that conflates author and narrator, right? So the watashi shousetsu came about later, but this might be seen as sort of a prototype for that style. But even when you're reading works that are consciously, avowedly watashi shousetsu, you should be wary of this fact. You should always be careful to make a distinction between the narrator and the author, because the author invariably fictionalizes things and he makes things up, and he makes connections between his own experience and the literary tradition, for example. Number 5 is a very simple question. Identify instances of foreshadowing in the work, right? Foreshadowing is a key literary term. I think the Japanese is fukusen suru is the word. Look up fukusen. And you see numerous instances of foreshadowing in this story. Number 6, the young woman offers Rohan a bath. How does Rohan react to her offer? Might bathing be symbolic of something? How does it relate to Rohan's inane, audacious, ambitious to, quote, endeavor to purify this frivolous world, right? So this notion of bathing, specifically of the woman's attempt to bathe him, and you see another famous scene of a woman attempting and succeeding in bathing a man in Izumi Kyoka's Koya Hijiri, which we read last semester in our Zemi. So there are many connections actually and similarities between this story and the famous story, The Saint of Mount Koya, Koya Hijiri, by Izumi Kyoka. So you, for your dissertation paper back at your home school, you might want to do a comparison of these two stories. Number 7, how does Tai, the female character in the story, how does she convince him to come into bed with her? What is Rohan's moral dilemma once he does so? How does he cope with it? What does his reaction tell us about Buddhist ideas of women, desire, lust, etc.? And there is sort of a strong misogynist strand within Buddhism that sees women as sort of figures that corrupt men, and you see elements of that in this story. So how do we see Buddhist ideas of women in the story explain that scene where she attempts to and eventually does get him to come into bed with her? I think she succeeds. I can't remember actually. It's been a year since I've read the story, so forgive me if I'm forgetting the details. Number 8. Why is it so important that the events take place in the countryside, right? So he leaves, the character Rohan leaves Tokyo in the beginning of the story. How is the country juxtaposed with the city? So in modern literature, you often see this juxtaposition, this sort of antithetical relationship between city and country. How do we see it here? What are the associations of each, as sort of suggested in the story? What are the associations of urban life? What are the associations of city life? Which is of rural life, country life? And which is associated with modernity, which with pre-modernity? Okay. Now moving into parts 2 and 3. Question number 9. Why is Rohan so adamant in resisting her advances? Why is he chanting Buddhist scripture, the elimination of desire specifically, while a half-naked beautiful woman lies beside him? Is this intended to be comical, ironical? Why doesn't he just leave? That's sort of a simple plot question. Number 10. Identify the 3 types of love that appear in this work. How is Rohan's Buddhist influence view of women, desire, love, etc. different from the young lord's Meiji Era chivalrous conception of love? So the character Rohan and the young lord in the story are sort of opposites of each other, and they sort of convey opposite ideas of love, opposite conceptions of love. Contrast those. How is Tai's view of love different from these two? So all 3 characters in the story sort of represent different ideas or notions of love. Explain those. That's the question for number 10. Number 11. How are usual gender roles reversed in this story? Right? What does this reversal suggest? What is Rohan's initial reaction to this reversal? The character Rohan's initial reaction to this reversal. What is his second reaction? The second reaction is key, right? His first reaction is sort of standard, conventional, man of the time, man of the Meiji Era reaction to a woman's aggressive, whatever, attempt to seduce him. But his second reaction is sort of a more profound, feministic, and Buddhist, non-misogynistically Buddhist understanding of female nature, right? So discuss the role of gender in this story in that question. Number 12 is, who is more mature, experienced, and wise? Tai, the female character, or Rohan? Who seems closer to a state of enlightenment? Explain, right? So the author, Kōda Rohan, is, as I said, is very influenced by Buddhist thought, which sometimes veers toward misogyny, as I mentioned. However, in this story, he sort of takes the conventional Buddhist ideas and flips them on their head in a way, and makes the female, I won't say anything more actually, I want you to think of your own answers to this very important question here. Who is more enlightened, basically? Tai or Rohan is the question. Number 13. Does Tai think that men should be trusted? What kind of men does she despise? Where does she learn to despise them? So number 12 and 13 kind of relate to each other. Number 14. Why does her suitor, Tai's suitor, fall so in love with her? What is ironic about this? Okay, it's sort of another simple plot question. Number 15. Why does Tai refuse the advances of her suitor? Why is she so persistent in her refusal? How does she react to his death? Does she feel any pity, remorse, or guilt? Okay, so another simple plot question. Number 16. Discuss the ending of the story. What is the significance of the grotesque description of Tai? So the final 2 or 3 pages, I think it's 2 pages, are Tai as she's metamorphosed into this grotesque creature. Describe that. What is the significance of this metamorphosis? What has happened to her? What is the author trying to tell us about the nature of physical beauty, the nature of human desire, and the nature of death? right? The story is sort of a meditation on death, as is pretty much everything in Buddhism. Number 17. What was the mother's dying wish after all? What was Tai's hereditary curse? Right? Underline this word hereditary curse. This is very important, and I think I'll give the answer away right now. It's leprosy, daibyo in Japanese, and leprosy was very big in Meiji Japan. A lot of people suffered from it, and it eventually came to acquire the name Hansenbyo, Hansen's disease, right? It's related to leprosy, I think. I don't know the details, but a lot of people have studied this. The head of our department, in fact, right now is sort of the world's leading expert on daibyo and kekkaku and all these various illnesses that were big in Meiji period. So consider that historical background as you think of this, as you consider this question. Number 18. Philosophers, writers, and critics have long argued over whether the primary goal of literature or art in general is to teach or to please. This is the question of whether art should be didactic or simply pleasurable. Should art instruct or should it simply provide pleasure to its audience? Kōda Rohan believed that literature's primary goal was to instruct. He was a firm believer in literature's ability to liberate souls from ignorance and bondage. Although much admired by later so-called aestheticist writers such as Tanizaki, again I mentioned aestheticism earlier, Tanbi Shugi in Japanese, although he was much admired by so-called aestheticist writers such as Tanizaki and so forth, Kōda Rohan was definitely not in their camp. So the question is, how might this story, the encounter with a skull, be considered a didactic work of literature? What is the message it is trying to convey? Explain. And the final question, 19. Turns out there are 19 rather than 20 questions. Discuss this theme of the conflict between Giri and Ninjo as it appears in the work, and Tai's response to this conflict, this dialectic. Giri is moral obligations or social obligations, and Ninjo is sort of human passions and human desires and whatnot. And back in the 1950s and 1960s, when Anglophone scholars really didn't know what to say when they were talking about Japanese literature, whatever they read, they'd always bring up this issue of Giri and Ninjo. So this is kind of a cliched conflict or dialectic, but it's still, nevertheless, present in a lot of Japanese works, and of course it's a central theme in all human art and literature and whatnot. Okay, so those are the 19 questions. Answer them to the best of your ability, and again, you don't need to answer every one super thoroughly. Answer the ones thoroughly that you think are most important, and the other ones just sort of write a brief answer that demonstrates that you know and that you have read the text and have understood it and are thinking about it. And the very last part of your study guide includes some particularities of culture to look up. So place names, Horai Mountain or Mount Panglai in Chinese is the mountain actually that appeared in the Song of Unending Sorrow by the poet Bai Zhouyi from the Tang Dynasty, right? So as I mentioned in that video, Horai Mountain or Mount Panglai appears in a lot of Japanese literature and a lot of Chinese literature. So why does Kōda Rohan include Mount Panglai in this story? Why is he making explicit connections with the Chinese tradition and with the Sino-Japanese tradition? Other places mentioned, Chuzenji is a famous temple you want to look up, see where it is. Poet alluded to in the story is Liu Xiahui. Matsuo Basho poem, an anecdote after turning down a prostitute is mentioned here. The poem is Kochira Muke, Ware mo Sabishiki, Aki no Kure. Very famous poem about a man who is turning down a prostitute. And Fujokan, there's a list of 16 particularities of culture. You can look and confirm all of those as you do your assignment. But one I want to talk about right now is Fujokan, is the contemplation of the 9 stages of decaying corpse. This is a traditional Buddhist practice that I don't think lay persons participated in this, but those who were striving to become a monk, aiming to become a monk, would often do this, and it's basically a meditation practice where you stand beside or sit beside a corpse from its first day up through I think the 30th day. You want to look into this, but the 9 stages of the decomposition take place in front of the meditator, and he sits and watches it happen in order to come to a deeper understanding of death, right? So looking up, I think this word appears in the story, and you want to look into that. Bodhisattva, Bosatsu in Japanese, very important in Buddhism, Nikko, Genji Monogatari, etc. Okay. And group questions I have at the very end for the Japanese students. You can look at those if you want, but the main questions are the 19 and the terms that I explained at the beginning of this video. So there's a lot to think about. I usually spend 2 weeks on this story because it's so dense. So perhaps we'll spend 2 weeks on this. Alright, that's all. If you have any questions, email me. Bye-bye.